Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are live for the final installment of our pilot series of Meeting Points. I'm Orestes Tringiris.
And I'm George Nicolaou.
And welcome everyone from Nicosia, Cyprus, who are listening to us live. And hello to everyone to you who are listening to us posterior and viewing our video as well in posterior. We're going to upload this on YouTube. George, is our final installment of our first 6 series. Goodness willing, we'll be back in September.
Yes.
With more rounds and with more issues that concern the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, like human rights, the environment, etc. What's our take for today, man?
So today we're going to talk about child soldiers. What constitutes a child soldier?
Yeah, what is a
basically?
child soldier, man?
Yeah.
That's our first thing. Where are the limits?
And we're going to hear it from our guests, and it's not for me to say it. Our guests have more experience on these things.
Mm-hmm. We have done our homework and we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, you can leave your comments on lemoniradio.com. Is the more box on the right hand side, and we'll be able to see your comments live and maybe your question as well. Let's start with introducing our guests.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say a warm thank you to your invitation to talk today about the most interesting topic. My name is Demetra Loizou. I'm a lecturer at UCLan Cyprus. I'm also a practicing lawyer. Now, in terms of child soldiers, how did my specialization arose? My PhD focused on the establishment and the early case law of the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court and its statute was the first formulation of child soldiering as a war crime. So it basically brought the question of child soldiering within the AIM period, within the scope of individual criminal responsibility. Now, as Joanna is more expert on the human rights sector, and I will leave it to her, up to that stage, the protection of children in general was more suited or best perceived to be a human rights issue. So now we have a more firm approach, a more robust approach when it comes to individual criminal responsibility. How does someone who recruits children voluntarily or involuntarily may end up before the deck? So this is what I've been doing. And interestingly so, the war crime of child soldiering is one of the most commonly charged crimes in the ICC. Now, all of the verdicts up to date, but one, have included the war crime of child soldiering within the charges. Mm-hmm. So it is a matter of growing interest, and what I've been dealing with is the extent to which these individuals' children are or are not lawful targets. Now, if someone is responsible for recruiting a child in armed conflict, a child which is recruited immediately under international humanitarian law is a lawful target. So where does the boundary lie, and should the court provide for a broad interpretation of the crime, but at the same time expose the children to lawful attacks? So this is what I've been dealing the last few months.
Yes, Joanna, can you please start from the top? Who are you? Where are you? What have you been doing? And give us your primer. I repeat the question for your research and your work on child soldiers and on the issue in general. Joanna, we go to you. Thank you.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm Joanna Dimopoulou, and I hold a PhD in philosophy and international affairs and human rights, and have worked for the Hellenic Mission in international organizations in Geneva and the European Commission, and I work on advocacy, human rights, and now the child soldiers reparation case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Friends, because I was away trying to figure out the connection. So, what are the limits of a child soldier? We had some practical questions before. For example, let's say there's a conflict. There's an armed conflict, official or unofficial, in a region, and some children in that region, they are forced by militiamen or whatever to just pass some food, bring them food. So they're not holding a gun, but they are bringing food, so they are contributing thus to one of the sides of the conflict, or maybe they pass messages or they are watching out for them, and in case the enemy comes, they just ring something. So where are the limits for child soldier?
If I can generalize the question a bit.
Yeah.
What is a child soldier? And how do you define one as a child soldier?
So it's for both of you.
Yes.
Joanna?
Dimitra started
Dimitra,
before,
yeah, you're saying. Okay, go on, Dimitra. Yeah, I'm just going to edit.
Will I start from the end and go to the beginning, and Joanna can join in?
All right, thanks for that.
Now, a child soldier is not a child who is found on the front line. It's not someone who necessarily carries a gun. This is very clear. So we have direct and indirect activities, which if there is a link between that activity and the contact of hostilities, the child who is a courier, a bodyguard, who is carrying food, may end up being considered to be a lawful target, and that's a child soldier.
Right. You said lawful target.
Okay, I'll take it a step back. What is international humanitarian law about? It's about how the game is carried out. It's the rules of the game. So even if someone, this might sound very crude, but if someone is killed during an armed conflict, this is perfectly legitimate if they are active combatants, if they are soldiers. So the international humanitarian law distinguishes between combatants and non-combatants, which in a very generalized way, we have the civilian population, which includes children. Yeah. So a child or anyone else who, as long as they do not take part in hostilities, they are entitled to protections under international humanitarian law, and thus they may not be a target of an attack.
Mm-hmm. Is that a good point for you, Joanna, to join in the conversation? Because you joined it early. What is your take on that, Joanna?
Well, lex specialis is always so interesting, but I would start from the beginning, as Aristotle would say, by definition. So a child associated with an armed force or armed group refers to any person, as Demetra would say, below 18 years of age, who is or has been recruited or used by an armed force or armed group in any capacity, boy or girl. This is according, of course, to the Paris Principle. Paris Principles on Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict, 2007. Though there is the definition complementary to this, but not official, stating that any girl or boy below the age of 18 who is recruited or used by an armed force or armed group in any capacity defines as a child soldier. Well, where, I think the where is of particular importance in this conversation. We have to place to place a little bit the loci we're interested in. So according to the 2020 report of the Secretary General of Children in Armed Conflict, there are 57 non-state actors and 7 state actors responsible for committing grave violations affecting children in situations of armed conflict, although the phenomenon is going on in over 20 countries. In elaborating further on the where, on the specific geographical area of the after Arab Spring countries, which concerns us on our file on child soldiers, the child soldiers' right to reparation case, I have to give some explanatory fact, right? So the estimated number of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria alone since 2011 is set between 30,000 and 42,000, a significant number of which have been minors. While reports of the recruitment and use of children by armed groups such as ISIS subsided as the so-called caliphate started losing control over territory in 2018, the overall number of verified cases of deployed children remained high. In some cases, it is reported that rather than being liberated, these children were actually simply passed on to the opposing side, becoming part of the spoils. The intervention by the Saudi-led coalition, which includes, of course, the United Arab Emirates, began in March 2015 and led by the Saudis. The intervention claims to be fighting to rescue Yemen from the Iran-backed Houthi rebels, right? So in Yemen, child soldiers were often brought by Sudan, including Darfur, fighting as mercenaries, accounting to 20 and sometimes 40% of the Sudanese battalion in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, of course, denies the reports of the New York Times, but there are those within the Security Council that attribute responsibility for this practice to the Saudi crown. The report also states that in December 2019, Riyadh offered impoverished Sudanese families up to $10,000 to send their children to fight in Yemen. In 2018 alone, more than 1,000 Yemeni children were forced to fight. And the ultimate responsibility for the deployment lies squarely within the Saudi regime. In December 2018, the UN were able to verify that actually 2,721 children were recruited to fight for all sides. This practice has apparently gained hold in Libya as well.
That was the next question will be, George. I mean, I'm wondering, George, what are the variations and what is your question?
Yeah, I see here in the hrw.org page.
Yeah.
I didn't find the name, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
So the fight on the front line participate in suicide mission, the act of spies, messengers, or lookouts.
Yeah.
And girls may be forced into sexual slavery.
Yeah, it's not something we hear very often, how our girls are being used in the war machine. We had examples, historical examples, of maybe a lot of historical examples in Vietnam, and into sexual slavery, or even working as both spies and also as basically sex slaves and prostitution. And I see Demetra is raising your hand and you want to have an intervention on that. Okay, go on.
Now, in terms of sexual violence, in addition to being an overlooked aspect of the armed conflict until the Second World War, was a collateral aspect of armed conflict, which was not even prosecuted per se. The sexual violence inflicted by female child soldiers, not only female child soldiers, also male child soldiers, has been vastly neglected. And why was the reason for this? Because these children are subjected to various forms of sexual violence by members of their own group. What does that mean? It means that international humanitarian law does not even come into place, does not become applicable, because international humanitarian law is there to regulate how opposing sides deal with each other. So the fact that children and child soldiers, both male and female, may have to endure sexual violence. For example, we have the phenomenon of bushwives. Has come to the notice, for example, of the International Criminal Court, but in terms of prosecution, it has been characterized by widespread impunity. Now, I want to add a couple of things to what Joanna has said. Now, there is a push towards what we call a straight 18 position in terms of not involving children in the conduct of hostilities. This is, as of yet, not universally accepted, and this is not a problem in countries like Libya or where ISIS is active. I mean, we will be surprised that even when it comes to countries within the EU, children below the age of 18 may end up in active combat. So it is a widespread phenomenon which is relevant not only in the cases that we have in mind, and also it has become more and more widespread and serious because of the fluidity of war. We don't have interstate wars nowadays. We have prolonged wars between different state-armed groups. We have change of alliances, territories changing control. I mean, ISIS lost control of the caliphate. So this provides the fertile ground for further exploitation of children.
Wow, that's very tough to hear.
Yes.
And especially with this. Are there any exemplar court cases that have been going or in the past, I'm addressing this question to you, Joanna and Demetra, where there has been a landmark change in the situation that actually helped the child soldiers? Of course, we have to have in mind what is the stage of conflict. Is it post-conflict or is it during the active conflict? So, Joanna, what is your first take on that? Go on, Joanna.
Well, with the Rome Statute of the ICC, I will have to go back to the history a little bit. The rights of victims of serious violations in international law were affirmed. For the first time, victims were acknowledged as stakeholders in international criminal proceedings, and numerous articles related to the right to reparation bear evidence to this effect. But there were major debates also regarding whether reparations orders from the ICC could be aimed not only at convicted individuals, but also at states. States were worried of the potential inclusion of state responsibility in the context of reparations, and the exclusion of such reference was a compromise to ensure the approval of Article 75 of the Rome Statute. We have to note states suffering from, as Robertson would put it, human rights amnesia here, deliberately declined to actually allow ICC to order reparations against governments. And as stated, this omission reflects one of the key weaknesses in the current philosophy behind the international justice movement, which denies the existence of collective responsibility in order to fasten upon the blameworthy individual. Where crimes against humanity are concerned, the two are not mutually excluded, and that's the sure thing. So in Dailo case, May had to compensate 427 child soldiers recruited by the Congolese warlord with $10 million, though state responsibility entails positive duties and may also be incurred when the state has omitted or failed to demonstrate due diligence to prevent violations.
Right. Thank you, Joanna. What is your take on that, Demetra? Do you have something to say, comment, or before we go to the next question? Yeah, we'll wait, no problem.
No, I don't have much to what Joanna has said. I mean, the ICC has brought a change in that for the first time the victims can qualify as parties to the proceeding. They make an application, and if they meet the prerequisites, they have a standing in the case and they have a legal representative. That said, though, it's a completely different thing as to what happens on the ground. I mean, who is entitled to compensation and reparation at the end of the day? The victims who are involved in the proceedings, or what happens to the wider community? And we also have the compromise when it comes to state responsibility, which Joanna has elaborated very clearly.
We live in an era of prolonged conflicts, as Demetra and Joanna, we both said before. And there are many complications, I understand. You said before, Demetra, that there are warlords changing sides, or the losing side has to basically give up their children by force to the winning side. So my question is, what happens to the case in the case of reparations by states when in conflicts where there is no official participation of state-level actors? What happens to the cases where there is conflict, but the responsibility of a recognized state is not very clear? What happens to those cases? Or what happens, let's put it easily, what happens to wars that not everybody agrees it's a war, to put it this way? So if it's not a war, that means the international law may or may not apply, or some stakeholders may consider that the law should apply or not apply in this case. Did I make any sense? And Joanna, if you want to take it on from here. Yes, take it on.
Joanna should be the one to step in here.
All right then. Joanna is yours.
I assume she's much more focused and familiar with the reparations than I am.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this question, both of you, the three of you. Well, regardless of how children are recruited, whether abducted or recruited as foreign fighters, and of their roles, regardless of their roles, child soldiers are victims, although treated as survivors, which is well respected, but not a legal term to generate legal results. So until now, we were just hoping on a long healing process of reintegration. But jurisprudence on reparations by human rights courts and entities do set important precedents and standards. However, major challenges are visible in their limited and, let's say, stretched capacity to monitor compliance by states. Comprehensive measures are required to be undertaken at the national level in order to ensure that the number of beneficiaries is expanded and that the most vulnerable victims are identified and prioritized when it comes to redress claims. In Prosecutor versus Dailo versus Thomas Lubanga Dailo case is elaborated in depth the how reparations proceedings should be improved, especially during the implementation stage. So reparation was reaffirmed as an internationally recognized human right with 5 key elements according to the principles, one of them being compensation. The ultimate goal of reparation is to restore human dignity. Reparations are invested with the need to redress gross violations of human rights. Therefore, the damage to the project of life should be considered and repaired.
Right, so George, you have a question,
Yeah,
and I have another question.
Yeah.
Go on with yours first.
So what happens to those children that survive a war or of them being soldiers? What happens to them when they grow up? Because this happened not now, not in the recent 5 years. I remember studying this in 2009 when Uganda was at war with itself.
Yeah, what happens to those children?
What happens to those children?
I mean, how they yeah, what happens?
Are they rehabilitated back into the society? What are the precautions taken for them? If there are any precautions taken for them?
Are there examples, or is there any movement to make states in international law to stipulate that you also have the responsibility to rehabilitations beyond reparations? Who wants to go, Joanna?
Well, we have to go on the why child soldiers as a fact is important today. I think this is the most important, to understand where these children are coming from, what they've been through. What I talked before about survivors not giving legal results, and I talked about a long healing process to reintegration. Well, children have become more vulnerable due to new tactics of warfare, the absence of clean battlefields, the use of tactics of extreme violence, the increasing number of diversity of armed groups that add to the complexity of these conflicts, and of course the deliberate targeting of traditional safe havens such as schools and hospitals. Of growing concern is the use of children to carry or plant explosive devices. In the past few years, we have witnessed an increase in the use of child suicide bombers. The detention of children is another concern. They can be detained because of their alleged association with an armed group or because they have allegedly participated in hostilities, instead of being considered victims of the adults who actually recruited them. Children are considered security threats.
Sorry.
When they are arrested, they are often detained without. So child soldiers have historically been considered a challenge linked to sub-Saharan Africa. It is estimated that more than 1 million children were forced into battle from Sudan to Congo. But since 2011, state failure and civil strife have allowed militias operating in North Africa and the Middle East to enlist children en masse. Other states in the region have facilitated this practice by recruiting and transporting children on behalf of their allies, as well as by providing weapons and ammunition, engaging in war by proxy. The practice, of course, has become commonplace throughout the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Demetra, back to you. Yes, wait a minute.
Sorry.
We're in the middle of Magairos Avenue, as you can hear, and as you can see behind us. So people are waving at us. So
I apologize for the delay. They hearing me. I mean, there is some delay when I mute my button. Now, continue from what Joanna has said. It's very difficult to provide a generalized answer. Okay, what happens to these children? First of all, do we have an end to the conflict? Do we have a frozen conflict? Do we have an official end to hostilities and the adoption of transitional justice measures, which include the integration of people in society, including children, of course? And another thing to bear in mind is, how do these children actually end up becoming part of an armed group? Mm-hmm. Now, there is, at the end of the day, under international criminal law, it does not matter whether these children end up there voluntarily or by force.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we also have the question, okay, are they capable of giving a valid consent? I mean, quite often they are being given by their own family because that's the best way out for them to survive, possibly, or to provide an income to the family. But it is, I mean, each conflict, it's quite unique. I mean, as John has said, we had an increased number of suicide bombers. I mean, this was especially employed by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. I mean, young children being sent in a market or a busy place to spread death and terror. So it is very much fragmented picture as to what happens to these children and whether we have reparations in place for them. But quite often we do not.
Is there any precedent, which a good example from the past that there have been reparations that they benefited mostly the children? I'm asking both of you.
A good example is what Joanna has mentioned, is the Lubanga Dilo case in the ICC, which was the first judgment of the International Criminal Court, and it only involved charges of child soldiering. We had prolonged proceedings in that respect. I don't know if Joanna wants to add something there with respect to the Lubanga case.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, do you want to add something to the... Yeah, go on, yeah. We cannot hear you. Okay, can you speak a bit slower maybe, Joanna?
Okay. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, states should bear primary responsibility to provide reparations for victims of armed conflict. This argument is supported both on legal grounds as well as on general moral obligations to promote and ensure equity and fairness and non-discrimination. It is clear that the state has positive duties to prevent violations and demonstrate due diligence. It has become increasingly frequent that states have been found to carry a degree of responsibility for omission to protect civilians when the perpetrators have been non-state actors. To this effect, there is actually a convergent approach in international law on state responsibility, which is illustrated in Article 2 of the International Law Commission articles on state responsibility. And the official commentary of the ICRC on Article 91 of the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, which also affirms that state responsibility may be incurred by omission when due diligence to prevent violation from taking place have not, of course, been demonstrated. Well, jurisprudence from regional human rights courts has further consolidated positive obligations of the state to prevent violations and demonstrate due diligence, including in the context of armed conflict. And examples of such cases are Mahmoud Kaya versus Turkey, and Mapiripan massacre versus Colombia. The consistent and convergent affirmation of positive obligations of the state translates into an obligation to assume responsibility for such violations, including reparations. As for moral grounds, if you're interested, if I can go on, I would say that the difficulties victims face in seeking reparations have been extensively documented in relation to international criminal law and the transitional justice initiatives in the given state case studies on reparations. It is immoral, unfair, and discriminatory that disproportionate amounts of resources are spent on offenders and the demobilization of former combatants, while their victims are left empty-handed. As noted in the report of the Secretary General on the rule of law and transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies, states have an obligation to act not only against perpetrators, but also on behalf of victims, including through the provision of reparations.
Will have been thanks, man. That would have been our next question. What should be done? But you already started answering it, Joanna. Let's. Okay. You want to add something before we move to Demetra, Joanna, or Demetra? Do you want to intervene something now?
Can I make a short contribution?
Okay.
I mean,
all right.
I agree with what Joanna has said. Now, Joanna has touched upon a very challenging aspect when it comes to armed conflict and non-state actors.
Yeah.
What are their rights and what are their obligations?
Mm-hmm.
We have traditionally perceived war as between country X and country Y. Now, the vast majority of armed conflicts are taking place within state borders, and sometimes they involve only non-state actors. So there's a growing understanding, both in international humanitarian law and international criminal law, that these, I would say in inverted commas, organizations, entities, I mean, there are certain criteria as to what constitutes a non-state actor, but this is not a place to elaborate on it.
Yes.
But they have an increasing number, not only of rights, but of responsibilities as to how they behave during an armed conflict.
Joanna,
including the recruitment of children, of course.
Including the recruitment of children, right. Joanna, what was your take? Take it on from here.
Excuse me, I lost you a little bit.
Oh, okay, all right. What is your take after the intervention of Demetra right now, especially on the non-state actors?
Non-state actors, I would just stick with the legal conclusion. Well, historically, international law viewed reparation, as already mentioned, as an interstate measure. However, the convergence of a number of developments in international law over the past decades has produced important shifts, and this is the important thing. What is also important is to finally accept the due diligence and the state responsibility for a mission. State or non-state actors, the state has the responsibility to protect.
Right. Let's take a very short break. You are listening, ladies and gentlemen, to Meeting Points every Monday or about 6 to 8 Cyprus time. It's me, Orestes Tringidis, and
I'm George Nicolaou. You can ask your questions for today's subject or show to morbidbox@lemoniradio.com.
And we have with us two very distinguished guests. Thank you for being with us, Demetra and Joanna. It's a very hard topic. On purpose, I took this small break because there are many things to consider. So let's leave the conversation open. We are done with questions so far, except that it's a very hard topic. How can you deal with it when working with that? You hear all sort of very disturbing stories. How do you deal with that?
And if I can add, what can we do?
And what can we do?
As individuals?
Yeah, and as media, we are a community media radio station here in the middle of Nicosia. So these are the two questions for now. How do you deal with the emotional effect of researching into such issue, and what can we as citizens and as media can do to contribute positively to this subject? It's an open-ended question, so we leave it to you. Whoever wants to go first.
I can get started. I mean, I'm predominantly working on international criminal law, so this is part of my everyday work. But the reason I got interested in such I won't say unpleasant, but very much disturbing topic is because it exists in such a widespread scale, and it happens next to us, and we are in complete ignorance as to what happens to vulnerable individuals who are caught in the midst of an armed conflict, being children, being women, being the elderly. It's wars won't end, but I'm hoping that it will end, but it's about protecting the vulnerable and those who are not involved in the conduct of hostilities, including children.
And without having any choice.
About it,
Go on.
You were about to say.
And without having any choice, you just have a normal life one day, and the next day, look, there is war, and now you are a child, but he has a gun. They don't even have a choice.
You have to fight for your life.
Yeah.
We need to understand also that sometimes going to war for, I don't know how it will sound, but going to war for some children is a better alternative for them to survive. I mean, how do we approach this? This is not only disturbing, but it's completely against any sense of humanity.
It's a fundamental moral question as well. It's beyond just the war crime. It's a deeply moral question.
Exactly.
Joanna, you want to take it from here?
Well, many child soldiers end up desensitized to violence, which can psychologically damage them, of course. It's understandable. Many are traumatized by what they have been forced to do or have witnessed. Children need to undergo reintegration. It's a long healing process to help them return to civilian life. Girls face the additional difficulty of social stigma attached to the belief they have been engaged in sexual activity. Most child soldiers have missed out, of course, on school and need additional education in order to feed themselves and make a more stable life for themselves. But it's all a matter of dignity. While the legal basis for claiming the right to reparation for victims of serious human rights violations have become firmly entrenched, we acknowledge some of the challenges that have arisen and that remain in order to assert that the right can be effectively exercised in practice. They have to be provided with the reparation. It's their right. And it's a matter of questioning the legal order. while human rights mechanisms have increased their efficiency, expanded their jurisprudence in the realm of reparations, and sought to undertake measures to monitor compliance by states, such mechanisms were not designed to address large numbers of victims in conflict situations. This worrisome lacuna needs to be addressed. The concept of state responsibility is maturing and should be maturing more alongside a customary right now to receive reparations.
There is something too that we would like our listeners to understand. George made up
Demetra
yes.
just blew my whole world away before. When you said that it's a better alternative for some children to participate in a war.
Why is it better alternative?
Why is it a better alternative?
Between life and death.
Oh, thanks very much. Oh, you're blowing us away. Okay.
An issue which we haven't, touched upon, and there is a growing discussion on it, and it's still, the situation is not quite clear to what extent. I don't necessarily agree with it, but to what extent are children as passive as we perceive them? There is a certain portion of academics that say, okay, children should have, to a certain extent, some responsibility, that they are much more capable of reflection, survival, and adjusting to horrendous situations. So, and that's just food for thought. I don't necessarily agree with it, but we also have this thought on the table.
So,
I'm sorry, George, if if this sounds even more disturbing.
Yeah, it's a very difficult subject, and we knew this. And okay, we're doing some jokes in between because we need to cope with this subject. It's a really hard subject, and I want to ask sorry from our listeners and viewers on YouTube if we are coping with jokes, let's say.
Yeah, so speaking of jokes and us being on this side of the table and you two being on the other side of the table, how does media deal with this issue? So what would be your critique on media on covering any conflicts and the involvement of children, fairly or unfairly? Because, for example, I understand that there are war childs in Cyprus too. In my neighborhood, I know there are children who came from Syria, from conflict societies. Their parents, they have been forced into conflict and they are since then missing. And they are being considered as basically war children. Maybe they had an involvement. So that's one subject that the media sometimes takes upon. So what is your critique? Because you are from the legal perspective, from your academia perspective, what is your critique on media? What are they missing out on when they're approaching the issue of child soldiers? And whoever wants to go first, please do. And you can also critique us as well, Orestes and George. Your criticism towards us is welcome.
Definitely missing out is, for example, children coming from nearby countries like Syria and Iraq after the fall of the ISIS caliphate, and irrespective of the extent to which these children were involved in war, there is a tendency, or I would say tendency for overgeneralization. Oh, these children were indoctrinated, these children will be prone to such contact in the future. These children should somehow be dealt with. But I think the EU as well, even though it has followed a consistent approach in agreeing with the ICC and the IHL framework, it has yet to adopt a uniform approach as to what happened with the returnees, both adults and children who return from conflict zones. So in order to reach a final point is, I think there is a lack of a comprehensive framework as to what happened with people who come from conflict zone, whether these are children or adults. but in the last few years, due to the advent of vices and other forms of extremism, there has not been an adequate care with respect to properly reintegrating and taking care of these children. Now, we have spoken about child soldiers, but going back to basics, going back to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, is about allowing a child to fulfill its development in terms of education, in terms of knowledge, in terms of activities. So we should place the child soldier phenomenon within this broader context as well.
You started, first of all, Joanna, would you like to add something before we move on to the next question?
Well, I would just like to stress that children associated with militias and armed groups should be treated primarily as victims. They were victims before they became perpetrators, and before all these, they were children. Children who have been abducted, recruited, used, exposed to violence at an early age should not be rehabilitated, in brackets, but should also be empowered, provided with a clear reparations entitlement.
All right. We started discussing. Sorry. Wait a minute.
Bag outside. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a noise. Demetra, you started. Your critique. You extended your critique. Sorry, to the lack of a common framework. So, us being an EU member state, what is lacking in the EU legal frameworks right here, and also application to protect those children, or the issue of child soldiers?
And generally in the United Nations, because it's the largest frame of states, the United Nations.
Yeah, also in that frame as well.
Now, in terms of the EU policy, and this does not only concern children, it concerns the phenomenon of returnees, also returning foreign fighters. The EU has found itself in a difficult position in the last few years as to how to deal with these people. Sometimes it has refused to take them back. Sometimes it has allowed them to be transferred to other countries for trial. Sometimes it has taken them back. So this is what I meant beforehand with the lack of a comprehensive framework. Joanna, I think, mentioned it beforehand. A large number, maybe, I don't know if it's the vast majority of foreign fighters who went to conflict zones came from EU member states, traveled from EU member states to go there.
Joanna,
now,
yes, Demetra, go on, yeah. You want to add
now,
something?
in terms of the UN framework, we have a number of fronts there trying to take action, but it is a larger organization with its pros and cons. We have the Convention on the Rights of the Child and obligations arising therein. We have the High Commissioner on Human Rights. We have the Secretary General's Undersecretary for Children and Armed Conflict. There is action taking place on many fronts.
Should we go to Joanna now, if you like something to add? Joanna?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Demetra. Well, I would just have to add that the comparison of jurisprudence of the international and regional human rights systems reveals that the approach to reparation varies considerably depending on the applicable provision on reparation, as well as the mandate and interpretation given by the relevant committee, court, or commission. Clearly, the regional human rights courts wield great advantages in their authority to order legally binding judgments. This has resulted in a significantly high compliance rate on reparations compared with the United Nations treaty bodies. Although the jurisprudence contains variations, there is convergence within the international and regional systems on key points, such as the affirmation of positive obligations of the state and the responsibility to prevent and protect against violations, including those committed by non-state actors in the context of armed conflict. The international and regional systems also differ regarding whether they consider individual or collective reparations measures. The United Nations Treaty Body system considers both aspects. While the decisions on individual petitions tend to take a restrictive approach, a more collective policy-oriented approach is applied in the recommendations contained in concluding observations. The European human rights system is faced with a sharp increase in cases, of which an increasing number have occurred in the context of armed conflict. While the European Court of Human Rights has traditionally been conservative with regard to reparations, it is important to acknowledge the precedent-setting role of the European Court of Human Rights, and that it over time has developed an extensive and more victim-oriented jurisprudence. It is gradually moving towards meeting policy-oriented judgments in order to address the overlap and backlog of cases, of course. And then the the Inter-American human rights system has been of key importance, but I won't go any further.
Well, we have 5 minutes, man. What do we do? How do you feel, first of all?
I'm feeling really depressed right now. It was a hard subject today, and we knew it.
We knew it. We said before, are we going to be able to tackle it? I don't know if Demetra and Joanna think we have done a good job or not. I asked you before.
Can I add a positive note?
Please, yes, please.
Yes. We need that.
I mean, 20 years or so ago, it would have been incomprehensible to say that someone could be convicted for the war crime of child soldiering. Exactly. Now it is firmly a part of international criminal law and arguably international customary law. So we are going in the right direction one way or another in terms of trying to deal with impunity, but there is still a long way to go. And of course, also when it comes to reparations that Joanna has very clearly set out previously.
The long way to go. So the future. So what are the next steps? What should be improved? And what was the work needed to be done, not just on the legal level, but what do you expect also from us as people with 2 microphones and putting things on YouTube? Your lights.
Well, first of
yes, go on.
First of all, interviews like today's, it has been a unique opportunity for me to talk about child soldiering. It's not something I've been speaking about Cyprus that we discuss frequently. I don't know what's your take on it. I mean, you are on the other side of the microphone, but I was quite surprised by the invitation, pleasantly surprised by the invitation.
Well, we're pleasantly surprised at both of you for coming here, and we would like to, before we go to the concluding remarks, we both like to repeat our thanks. Joanna, what is your concluding remarks for the last couple of minutes we have for the show? The microphone is yours, Joanna.
Well, the logical consequence of the recognition of human rights as use cogents implies that the individuals appear as rights bearers or subjects in general international law, having afforded individuals such standing in international law, the need to translate consequences of breaches such as reparations in favor of individual victims becomes apparent. The right of individuals to receive reparations for serious violations is an indispensable corollary in order to provide an effective remedy for the violations suffered by these children. As noted by Judge Higgins, rights suppose a correlative obligation on the part of the state. Without a remedy, a right may be an empty shell.
Any last words? Anyone? Demetra, you have a last word. Okay, go on.
Just a concluding remark on reparations. I mean, we have taken it for granted, but reparations takes many forms. It's compensation, an individual receiving a monetary value, is restitution, trying to bring the individual to their original situation as much as possible. It's a guarantee that something will not occur again. So what we perceive as reparations is a multi-faceted tool which can be adjusted according to the specific conflict and the circumstances of the conflict or the individuals who have suffered in that conflict. So it's not a fixed tool, it's a tool which can be tailored to the circumstances and individuals.
Well, from my side, I have nothing else to add rather than thank you both, Joanna Dimopoulou and Demetra Loizou, for joining us and taking time from your personal time and from your work to come and share with us here in the studio, but also anyone listening or viewing this video. Thank you very much. Thank you, George. What is your final take?
I would like to thank also Joanna and Demetra for being here today, well, at least virtually.
And I couldn't have done it without you, George. So
Yes.
thank you. Believe me, it was. I told you it's gonna be very hard. How are we gonna be able to do it? And I can't believe 1 hour passed.
I want to finish.
Yes, finish off. Yeah.
Thank you for trying with us and raise awareness about this subject. At least for us, this is the best we can do for now. I think everyone
Thank
should try to do
Amen.
their best.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Demetra.
Thank you, Joanna.
And thank you to our listeners for bearing with us and for taking things in. And let's hope for our best. I hope we have done a decent job here, all the four of us. Okay.
Absolutely.